people imagine that the big turning points in life show up like a thunderstorm. They picture some huge mistake, a sudden collapse, or a dramatic moment where everything falls apart in a way that's impossible to ignore. When people think about failure, they often imagine a situation so obvious that anyone would see it coming. They assume that if something truly dangerous were happening in their life, it would show up with enough warning and noise that they would immediately recognize it. But life usually doesn't work that way. The biggest losses people experience rarely arrive with a loud crash. More often they show up quietly, almost in a polite way, through small choices that seem harmless when they're made. Someone puts off learning something useful. They delay dealing with a problem that feels uncomfortable. They choose the easier option instead of the more disciplined one. And the moment passes without much thought. This is where the real danger starts to appear. Each of those moments feels too small to matter very much. If someone puts off something difficult today, it doesn't look like a decision that will change their life. If they delay improving a skill for a month, the consequences seem almost invisible. The mind quickly tells itself that nothing important has really happened. And because the moment looks unimportant, it moves on without much reflection. The truth is that life is rarely shaped by the occasional dramatic decision that stands out. Instead, it is shaped by the repeated decisions that quietly stack up over time. One postponed effort may seem trivial by itself, but when the same delay happens again next week and then again the week after, a pattern begins to form. What once looked like a single moment slowly turns into a habit, and habits have a powerful way of setting direction. Most people don't notice when that direction starts to shift. There is no alarm clock ringing to tell someone that time is slipping away. There is no visible sign that a person has started repeating a pattern that could quietly cost them years. The days still look familiar. The routine still feels comfortable. On the surface, life appears almost exactly the same as it did before. The problem is that patterns rarely announce themselves while they're being formed. A harmful pattern doesn't arrive with a warning label that says, "This choice will quietly redirect the next decade of your life." Instead, it blends into normal behavior so smoothly that the person repeating it feels completely ordinary. They believe they're simply getting through the day, making practical decisions, and moving forward just like everyone else. As time passes, those everyday decisions begin to add up. A person postpones one improvement that would require effort. They delay one responsibility that demands discipline. They avoid one opportunity that feels uncertain or uncomfortable. None of those choices look dramatic on their own, yet together, they slowly start shaping the direction of that person's life. What's interesting about patterns is that they grow quietly. When someone repeats the same behavior long enough, the mind stops questioning it. Something that once required a conscious decision eventually becomes automatic. The person begins moving through their routine almost on autopilot, repeating the same responses day after day, because those responses have become familiar. This is why the most dangerous patterns in life are usually the ones people don't notice while they're happening. People expect danger to look dramatic, but real danger often looks very ordinary. It shows up in small delays, quiet avoidance, and comfortable routines that never quite push someone to grow. Because those actions don't look harmful in the moment, they can continue for years without being questioned. Think about someone who decides to postpone learning a valuable skill. They might tell themselves they'll start next month when things calm down a little. When next month finally arrives, something else suddenly feels more urgent. Each delay sounds reasonable at the time, and because every postponement seems small, it never feels like a serious issue. But months quietly turn into years. The skill that could have been developed through steady effort never gets built. Opportunities that required that ability quietly go to someone else. The person often doesn't notice the moment those opportunities disappear because the loss happens gradually instead of all at once. Time has a way of revealing patterns long after they have already influenced the outcome. Someone might look back after 10 years and wonder why certain doors never opened for them. They may feel confused about why progress seemed slower than expected. What they often realize is that the answer was hidden in small decisions, repeated again and again. Those decisions didn't look dangerous when they were made. Each moment seemed reasonable at the time. Each delay felt temporary and easy to justify. Yet when those choices were repeated often enough, they quietly created a pattern that shaped the direction of the years that followed. There's something interesting about how people behave once a pattern becomes familiar. After a while, that pattern starts to feel normal. Most people rarely question the habits that have become part of their daily routine. If someone has spent years postponing improvement, avoiding the difficult things, or delaying important action, those behaviors eventually start to feel natural. The person may not even realize they're repeating the same pattern again and again. The mind is very good at justifying familiar behavior. When someone postpones something important, they can quickly come up with a reason that sounds logical. They might believe the timing isn't quite right yet, or they may convince themselves that things will be easier later. Each explanation feels sensible in the moment, which allows the pattern to continue without much resistance. Eventually, the pattern becomes almost invisible. The person believes they are simply responding to circumstances as they come up, but the same reaction keeps appearing again and again. It becomes part of their routine, part of their thinking, and eventually part of the results they experience in life. The reason this kind of pattern becomes so costly is that time doesn't stop while someone is repeating it. Every postponed effort quietly spends a little more time. Every delayed improvement increases the distance between where a person is and where they could have been. Because these changes happen slowly, they rarely attract immediate attention. Years can slip by surprisingly fast when patterns go unexamined. Someone may wake up one day shocked by how quickly time has moved, wondering why certain goals were never completed. In many cases, the answer isn't some dramatic failure, but a quiet pattern that repeated itself long enough to shape the final result. Life tends to respond to the actions that are repeated most often. The direction of a person's future is rarely determined by occasional intentions or brief bursts of motivation. It is usually determined by consistent behavior over time. When someone repeats the same comfortable responses for years, those responses eventually define the limits of what their life becomes. This is why one of the most valuable skills a person can develop is the ability to recognize patterns early. The moment someone becomes aware that a pattern is forming in their behavior, they gain the opportunity to interrupt it. Awareness brings attention to something that previously blended into routine, and once it becomes visible, it can be examined and changed. For many people, the real tragedy isn't a lack of intelligence or opportunity. The real tragedy is that they never notice the small pattern quietly shaping their time. They assume the years are simply passing on their own, when in reality, those years are being shaped by repeated decisions that looked insignificant when they first appeared. A pattern that ends up costing someone years rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. Most of the time, it feels ordinary. It feels reasonable. It feels like the natural flow of everyday life. Yet beneath that normal appearance is a quiet force that slowly determines the direction of a person's future. Once someone understands this idea, they begin to look at their daily decisions differently. They start paying attention to the small moments that used to pass without notice. They realize that the direction of a life is almost never decided in one dramatic moment. Instead, it is decided by the quiet repetition of choices that seem harmless while they are gradually shaping the years ahead. And one of the most common choices that quietly shapes those years is the choice of comfort. Comfort has a strange way of showing up in a person's life. It almost never presents itself as something dangerous or harmful. Most of the time, it appears in the form of relief. Someone works hard for a while, solves a few problems, and eventually reaches a point where things start to feel manageable again. The days become predictable, the routine feels familiar, and the pressure to push themselves begins to fade. In the beginning, that comfort often feels deserved. There's nothing wrong with enjoying some stability after putting in effort. A farmer rests after planting his fields. A craftsman takes a break after finishing a long project. Rest itself isn't the issue. The real problem begins when comfort slowly changes from a short pause into a permanent preference. You see, comfort usually doesn't force people to move backward. Instead, it gently encourages them to stay exactly where they already are. That encouragement is subtle and almost impossible to notice at first. A person may start repeating the same habits, the same routines, and the same ways of thinking, simply because those patterns no longer require much effort to maintain. The mind naturally leans toward what feels familiar. Familiar surroundings create a sense of safety, and that sense of safety can easily be mistaken for progress. A person might start believing they're doing well simply because nothing in their life feels difficult anymore. But real growth rarely takes place inside the boundaries of complete comfort. Think about the way people develop new skills. Whenever someone starts learning something unfamiliar, there's always a stage where things feel awkward. The beginner struggles with the basics, makes plenty of mistakes, and moves forward slowly. That early stage feels uncomfortable because the person is operating outside their current level of ability. However, if someone begins prioritizing comfort above everything else, they quietly start avoiding those difficult stages. They may remain at the same level of ability because pushing beyond it requires effort and patience. The familiar routine feels easier, so the routine continues exactly as it is. At first, there doesn't seem to be any clear consequence for this choice. The person still gets up every day, follows their normal schedule, and moves through life as usual. Since nothing dramatic happens, staying comfortable seems perfectly reasonable. But over time, the cost slowly begins to show itself. While one person stays within the safety of their familiar habits, someone else is pushing themselves to grow. Another person is learning new skills, exploring unfamiliar challenges, and becoming more capable year after year. The gap between those two paths might look small at the beginning, but the distance quietly grows wider as time passes. Comfort has a way of hiding limitations. A person might live inside the same boundaries for years, without realizing those boundaries have slowly turned into a cage. Nothing around them forces them to question their habits. The routine still works well enough, and because it works, it feels acceptable. This is the moment when comfort turns into a trap. Not because comfort itself is bad, but because it can slowly convince someone that their current situation is good enough to remain exactly the same. When that belief settles in, curiosity begins to fade. Ambition starts to soften. The drive to improve becomes weaker because nothing in the present situation seems to demand change. The trap is difficult to notice because it doesn't feel restrictive while it's forming. A person may feel relaxed rather than confined. They may believe they're simply enjoying stability in their life. Yet while they remain in that familiar space, their growth quietly begins to slow down. Human potential only expands when it is challenged. Muscles grow stronger when they are pushed past their previous limits. Skills improve when they are practiced under greater difficulty. Even a person's character develops through moments that require courage, discipline, and persistence. When comfort becomes the top priority, those challenging moments are often avoided. The mind starts choosing the path that requires the least resistance. Tasks that seem demanding get pushed to another day. Opportunities that involve uncertainty are declined. Gradually, the person becomes used to operating within a very narrow range of effort. What makes this pattern strange is that it can continue for years without drawing much attention. Life may look stable from the outside. Bills are paid, routines continue, and responsibilities are handled well enough to keep everything in order. Since nothing falls apart, the person may assume that everything is fine. But stability is not the same as progress. A ship sitting safely in a harbor is protected from storms, but it will never reach another shore. Safety can preserve the present moment, yet it cannot create growth if the ship never leaves the harbor. Comfort gently persuades people to stay anchored. It tells them that tomorrow might be a better time to take a risk. It suggests that stretching themselves can wait until circumstances improve. Each of these thoughts sounds reasonable in the moment, but they quietly delay the very actions that create progress. Years later, a person may look around and realize that very little in their life has actually changed. The same abilities remain, the same routines continue, and the same boundaries still shape what they can do. At that point, they may start wondering why their life feels smaller than they once imagined it would be. In many cases, the answer is not some dramatic mistake or obvious failure. The answer is the quiet influence of comfort that slowly turned into a trap. By choosing what felt familiar day after day, the person unintentionally limited their own growth. Comfort becomes especially dangerous when it convinces someone that improvement is no longer necessary. Once that belief settles in, growth starts to feel optional instead of essential. The person stops seeking new challenges because they no longer feel the need to evolve. But life continues to move forward whether a person grows or not. Industries change, opportunities shift, and circumstances evolve. When someone stays in the same place for too long, they eventually realize that the world around them has moved ahead. The irony is that comfort once felt like protection. It felt like the safest place to stay. Yet over time, refusing to step outside that comfort slowly reduces a person's ability to adapt, learn, and compete with changing situations. Real growth always includes a certain amount of friction. There will be effort, uncertainty, and even the occasional failure along the way. Those experiences are not signs that something is wrong. They are signs that a person is stretching their abilities and expanding what they are capable of doing. Once someone understands this idea, they begin to view comfort differently. Instead of chasing it constantly, they learn to balance it with challenge. They allow themselves to rest when needed, but they do not allow rest to turn into long-term stagnation. A life built entirely around comfort slowly becomes smaller. The person stops stretching, stops experimenting, and stops discovering what they might actually be capable of accomplishing. Meanwhile, time keeps moving forward, quietly recording the cost of staying where things felt safe. Comfort may feel good in the moment, but when it becomes the main pattern in someone's life, it slowly turns into a quiet trap. It convinces them to stay exactly where they are, even when their potential is asking them to move beyond the boundaries that once felt so secure. And one of the habits that quietly supports that kind of comfort shows up in a lot of people's lives. And at first, it doesn't seem like a big deal. It doesn't look like laziness. And it rarely feels like someone is outright refusing to do something. Instead, it usually appears as a simple sentence people repeat to themselves over and over again. The sentence is short, reasonable, and very convincing. It usually sounds something like this: I'll deal with that later. Most people don't intentionally resist progress. They don't wake up in the morning and decide that they're going to avoid improving their life. In fact, many people genuinely want to grow, learn new things, and move forward. The real issue usually isn't a lack of desire. The real issue is the habit of postponing things, which slowly interferes with that desire without the person fully noticing it. Postponing something feels very different from refusing to do it. When someone refuses to do something, the decision is final and clear. The mind understands that the opportunity has been rejected, and there's no confusion about what happened. But postponement creates the feeling that the action will still happen someday, which makes the delay seem harmless. When a person tells themselves they'll handle something later, they still feel like progress is part of the plan. They believe they haven't given up on the goal. In their mind, they're just waiting for a better time to begin. The problem is that this better time almost never shows up on its own. Life has a way of constantly filling itself with new demands and distractions. Someone who postpones the important stuff today will almost certainly run into new responsibilities tomorrow. Obligations start piling up, unexpected problems show up, and the mind begins to believe that the current moment still isn't the right time to take action. Each delay becomes easier the more often it happens. The first time someone postpones something important, they may feel a small amount of discomfort. They might remember that they intended to act sooner, and they may briefly question whether waiting was the right decision. But if the same delay happens again the following week, that uncomfortable feeling begins to fade. The mind slowly adapts to the pattern. Eventually, postponing things turns into a habit. Instead of dealing with challenges right away, the person automatically pushes them into the future. The phrase, "I'll deal with that later," becomes a normal part of their thinking. Because the delay feels temporary, it rarely seems like a serious mistake. But time responds to action, not intention. The calendar keeps moving forward no matter what someone plans to accomplish someday. Every postponed decision quietly increases the distance between the present moment and the progress that could have been made. Imagine someone who wants to improve their knowledge in a certain subject. They might buy a book, sign up for a course, or make a plan to study on a regular schedule. But when the moment arrives to actually begin, something else suddenly feels more urgent. The study session gets pushed to the next day, then to the following week, and eventually the book ends up collecting dust while the intention remains untouched. What makes this pattern so deceptive is that the person never completely gives up on the goal. They keep telling themselves they'll start soon because the plan still exists in their mind. It feels like progress is only temporarily paused. Meanwhile, the weeks quietly pass while nothing actually happens. The habit of delay has a remarkable ability to stretch time without a person fully noticing it. One postponed action may only cost a day or two. But when that same delay happens again and again, the lost time begins to add up. Something that could have been completed in a month might stay unfinished for years simply because it was never started when the opportunity first appeared. This habit doesn't just affect each thing you do. Over time, it starts influencing how a person approaches responsibility itself. Someone who frequently postpones improvement begins to treat time as if it can always be borrowed from the future. They assume there will always be another chance to begin, another season to prepare, another opportunity to fix what was neglected. Unfortunately, time doesn't work that way. Every season that passes removes one opportunity and replaces it with a different set of circumstances. Someone who delays learning a skill today may find that tomorrow suddenly requires the very ability they chose not to develop earlier. You can see this pattern in many everyday situations. A person postpones improving their health because they feel too busy. They delay organizing their finances because it seems complicated or overwhelming. They postpone important conversations in their relationships because the discussion might be uncomfortable. Each one of those delays seems understandable when looked at by itself. Life often throws situations at us that demand immediate attention, and it's natural to focus on what feels urgent. But when the same postponements keep happening over and over again, the habit quietly begins shaping the future. The person who postpones improvement today usually postpones it tomorrow as well. The mind becomes used to the delay, and eventually the person stops questioning it altogether. Starting immediately begins to feel unusual, while postponing things starts to feel normal. After a while, the consequences begin to show up. Health that could have gradually improved becomes weaker instead. Financial stability that could have been built slowly never quite develops. Opportunities that required preparation quietly pass by because the preparation was always scheduled for later. The tragedy of postponement is that it rarely looks dramatic enough to raise alarm. If someone lost an entire year because of an obvious failure, the situation would be impossible to ignore. But when that same year disappears through hundreds of small delays spread across many days, the loss becomes much harder to recognize. That is why the habit of delay slowly grows over time. A person believes they are only postponing one small thing, but that small delay becomes part of a larger pattern. Each repetition strengthens the habit, and the habit gradually shapes how the person responds to every new opportunity that appears. Someone who takes action right away begins to build momentum. They develop the habit of addressing challenges while their intention is still fresh. Their progress may not look dramatic in the beginning, but steady action slowly moves them forward. The person who constantly postpones action experiences the opposite. Their intentions may still be strong, but the gap between intention and execution keeps growing wider. Eventually, that gap becomes so large that the person starts doubting their own discipline and ability. But the real issue was never a lack of ability. The real issue was the quiet habit of postponement that expanded little by little over time. What started as a simple delay slowly turned into a pattern that consumed months and eventually years. Recognizing this pattern is one of the most valuable insights a person can gain. The moment someone notices the habit of delay in their own behavior, they begin seeing how often the mind suggests waiting instead of acting. Once that awareness appears, the person has the opportunity to respond differently. Instead of pushing responsibility into the future, they can deal with it in the present. Instead of waiting for perfect conditions, they can start working with the circumstances that already exist. Time rewards action taken today far more than plans saved for tomorrow. The difference between real progress and quiet stagnation often comes down to one decision: whether someone chooses to act while the opportunity is right in front of them, or whether they postpone the effort for a later moment that may never truly arrive. And once a person begins to understand this, they also begin to notice one of the strongest forces shaping a person's life. It isn't luck, and it isn't some mysterious advantage that only a few people receive. The thing that quietly influences so many outcomes is repetition. What someone does once may not matter very much, but what they do again and again eventually becomes the direction their life takes. People tend to underestimate how much small choices add up over time. A single action can feel almost meaningless when it stands by itself. Reading a few pages of a book might not seem like a big accomplishment. Skipping that reading session might not feel like a big loss either. But when those same decisions happen day after day, their impact begins to grow. Life is always compounding something in the background. Every repeated action quietly builds on the one that came before it. A person might not notice the results right away because compounding usually works slowly at first. In the early stages, the changes look small, sometimes so small they're almost invisible. But when repetition continues long enough, the results begin to grow much faster. Think about it. Reading 10 pages in a day doesn't seem like a huge effort. It might take less than 30 minutes, and it can feel like very minor progress. Yet when someone keeps doing that every day, something interesting starts to happen. 10 pages become 70 pages in a week, hundreds of pages in a month, and several books over the course of a year. Now imagine that habit continuing for 10 years. The person who reads a little bit every day will end up accumulating a tremendous amount of knowledge without ever feeling overwhelmed by the process. The progress didn't come from a dramatic burst of effort. It came from a small action repeated consistently over time. The same principle also works in the opposite direction. Someone who avoids learning anything new for years might not feel the cost right away. Their daily routine continues, their responsibilities still get handled, and nothing suddenly falls apart overnight. Yet the absence of growth quietly compounds just as much as steady improvement does. As time goes on, the person who avoids learning slowly falls behind the people who are improving little by little. The difference may not be obvious in the first year or two, but as the years keep passing, the gap becomes harder and harder to ignore. The person who invested small amounts of effort each day eventually develops a depth of knowledge that the other person never gained. This is how compounding works. It turns repeated behavior into long-term results. Small improvements gradually build into major progress, while small neglects gradually turn into serious limitations. What starts as a tiny difference eventually grows into a large separation. Many people misunderstand this process because they expect results to appear quickly. When someone starts a positive habit, the early stages often don't look impressive. A person might read regularly, practice a skill, or spend time improving themselves. Yet the visible rewards seem very small at first. Because progress appears slow in the beginning, some people lose motivation and stop the effort entirely. They don't realize that compounding requires patience, just as a seed spends time growing roots beneath the soil before anything appears above the ground. Repeated effort needs time before the results begin to show. Someone who understands compounding approaches things differently. They aren't discouraged by slow beginnings because they know the direction of their actions matters more than immediate results. Every small effort becomes another layer added to the foundation of their future. Instead of chasing recognition right away, they focus on the steady accumulation of improvement. This way of thinking changes how a person views everyday choices. Instead of asking whether a single action matters very much, they start asking what would happen if that action were repeated for years. The answer to that question reveals the true power behind decisions that once seemed small. One day of neglect may not cause any noticeable damage, but if neglect becomes a daily habit, the accumulated cost can become extremely large. Skills that could have been developed remain weak. Opportunities that required preparation never appear within reach. The person may wonder why certain possibilities never came along, without realizing that the foundation for those opportunities was never built. Patterns become powerful through repetition. A positive habit repeated hundreds of times slowly turns into a strength. A negative habit repeated just as often slowly becomes a limitation. The repetition itself is what gives the pattern its force. This is why life rarely changes because of occasional bursts of effort. A person might feel motivated for a short time and work extremely hard for a few days. That energy can create some progress, but it rarely produces lasting change unless the effort continues consistently. Consistency is what activates the compounding effect. When someone repeats constructive behavior regularly, the results slowly begin reinforcing themselves. Skills become easier to use, knowledge becomes easier to apply, and confidence grows as the person begins seeing evidence of their improvement. The opposite pattern produces very different results. Inconsistent effort prevents the compounding process from building momentum. Someone who improves only once in a while never allows their habits to strengthen. Every time they stop and then start again, the process resets back to the early stages. One remarkable thing about compounding is that it doesn't care whether the repeated behavior is helpful or harmful. The process simply magnifies whatever someone does most often. If a person consistently works on improving themselves, compounding multiplies that growth. If someone consistently avoids improvement, the same process multiplies stagnation. This means that each day a person is quietly contributing to the direction their future will take. Every repeated choice becomes another piece added to the pattern shaping the years ahead. The person may not see the results right away, but the accumulation continues steadily in the background. Think of a long journey made one step at a time. A single step might look insignificant, but thousands of steps eventually carry someone across great distances. The direction of those steps determines where the traveler ends up. Human lives work in much the same way. Every small decision becomes another step along a path that stretches into the future. If those steps move toward improvement, the path leads toward growth and expansion. If those steps avoid growth, the path slowly becomes narrower. When someone understands the compounding nature of repeated choices, they gain a powerful advantage. Instead of constantly searching for dramatic breakthroughs, they begin paying close attention to the habits that appear every day. They realize that quiet actions repeated consistently will eventually produce results far greater than occasional bursts of enthusiasm. This understanding changes the way a person approaches daily behavior. Small constructive actions start to feel more valuable because they contribute to something larger over time. Neglect begins to look more concerning because it reveals a pattern that could slowly shape the years ahead. Life is always building something through repetition. Whether that structure becomes strong or fragile depends on the choices a person repeats most often. The future is rarely decided by one dramatic moment. More often, it is determined by the compounding effect of small decisions that quietly guide a person's direction over many years. And once a person recognizes how powerful repetition really is, the truth begins to appear in everything we've been talking about. And it's something a lot of people overlook. The same force that allows a pattern to quietly steal years from someone's life is the very same force that allows a person to take those years back. If repeated behavior can slowly push a life in an unproductive direction, then repeated behavior can just as easily guide it back toward progress. Patterns are not permanent structures that are carved into stone. They only exist because certain actions are repeated often enough that they eventually become routine. When those actions begin to change, the pattern that depended on them begins to weaken. It may not disappear immediately, but it cannot keep going forever if the behavior that created it stops being repeated. Understanding this gives a person a surprising amount of control over their future. Many people believe they are trapped by the patterns that shape their past. They look at their habits and assume those habits are permanent parts of who they are. But habits are not permanent. They are simply behaviors that have been practiced often enough that they begin to feel automatic. Once someone understands that idea, change starts to look much less mysterious. The process doesn't require a dramatic transformation or some sudden burst of incredible effort. In most situations, change begins in a much simpler way. It begins when a person decides to interrupt a familiar pattern at the moment it shows up. Think about someone who has spent years putting off the difficult things. The habit of delay might feel almost automatic at this point. Whenever responsibility appears, the mind quickly suggests dealing with it later. That response may have been repeated so many times that it now feels completely natural. But the moment that person becomes aware of the pattern, something important changes. Awareness creates a pause between the impulse and the action. Instead of automatically postponing something like before, the person suddenly has the opportunity to respond in a different way. That pause might only last a few seconds, but those few seconds contain the possibility for real change. If the person chooses to act immediately instead of postponing, they have just interrupted the pattern that used to guide their behavior. In the beginning, interrupting that pattern might feel uncomfortable. The mind has become used to the familiar routine, and any change to that routine can feel strange at first. Acting right away may require discipline, and the effort might feel harder than simply repeating the old habit. But repetition works in both directions. The more often a person practices a new behavior, the more familiar that behavior becomes. Just as a negative pattern was built through repetition, a positive pattern can be built through the exact same process. The first few interruptions may require deliberate effort. A person has to consciously choose to act differently because the old pattern still has momentum. However, each time the new response is repeated, it becomes a little easier. The mind slowly adapts to the new routine, and over time, the constructive response starts to feel natural. This is usually how real change takes place. It rarely happens through a single dramatic moment that instantly transforms everything. Instead, it develops through steady decisions that slowly replace the old pattern with a new one. Someone who begins acting immediately instead of delaying responsibilities may notice small improvements at first. Tasks start getting finished sooner. Opportunities are handled while they are still available. The sense of progress slowly replaces the frustration that once came from constant postponement. As time passes, those small improvements begin to add up. Responsibilities that once lingered for weeks get handled quickly. Confidence starts to grow because the person sees the results of consistent action. What started as one small interruption gradually turns into a new pattern that guides everyday behavior. This same principle applies to many different areas of life. Someone who has avoided learning for years can start by reading a few pages each day. At first, those pages may not seem very significant, but they represent the beginning of a different pattern. With enough repetition, the habit of learning quietly replaces the habit of neglect. Another person might decide to improve their discipline when handling responsibilities. Instead of waiting for perfect conditions, they begin dealing with important matters as soon as they appear. Each completed task strengthens the new habit of responsibility. And over time, the person becomes known as someone who follows through. What makes these changes interesting is that they usually begin with very small actions. One disciplined decision may not transform a life overnight, but it changes the direction of the pattern. Once the direction changes, repetition begins, carrying the person toward a different future. Many people wait until they feel extremely motivated before trying to change their habits. They assume that transformation requires a powerful emotional surge that pushes them into action. Motivation can certainly help, but it is rarely the thing that determines long-term results. What truly changes a life is the willingness to act consistently, even when motivation is average or even low. The person who builds lasting progress does not depend on intense feelings. Instead, they rely on simple discipline, repeated day after day. Each time the new behavior appears, the old pattern weakens a little more. The habit that once controlled the routine slowly loses its strength because it is no longer being reinforced. At the same time, the constructive behavior grows stronger through repetition. Eventually, the new pattern begins to feel just as natural as the old one once did. The person who used to postpone improvement now takes action quickly. The person who once avoided responsibility now handles it with confidence. From the outside, the change might look dramatic, but it was actually built through a long series of small decisions. One of the most encouraging things about this process is that it can begin at any moment. A person does not need to wait for a special season, a new year, or the perfect opportunity. The decision to interrupt a pattern can start today with the very next responsibility that appears. Time will keep moving forward no matter what someone decides to do. Another year will arrive just as surely as the last one did. The real question is whether that year will be guided by the same pattern that quietly consumed the previous ones, or whether a new pattern will start shaping the future instead. The difference between those two outcomes often begins with one simple decision made during an ordinary moment. When someone recognizes the pattern that has been repeating and chooses to respond differently, they begin redirecting the course of their life. The pattern that once stole years slowly loses its influence, replaced by new habits that gradually build a stronger and more intentional future.